Welcome to Free Speech Forward. We are a new podcast series showcasing a unique behind-the-scenes perspective on the how and why that free speech activists came to their position defending this most critical of values. Free Speech Forward is brought to you by 1776 Forward in co-sponsorship with the ILV, the Institute for Liberal Values. I'm your host, Chris Bush, one of the co-founders of 1776 Forward, and I'm joined today by my co-founder of 1776 Forward, Joia Huenica. Great to have you, Joia. Today's a really exciting day because we are finally launching Free Speech Forward, this new initiative, which we're very excited about. So we're going to start by telling you a little bit about ourselves, kind of turning the mic and the camera around in the other direction so you can hear our stories. And we will kind of model the discussion format we plan to replicate across each of our interviews. We're aiming to keep it short and sweet so that it's digestible for all of you out there listening. And we're going to keep the same format. We have kind of 5 core questions to really get the backstory from our guests. And if we have time, we'll ask some follow-up questions as well. But that's kind of our format. And so we're going to dive right in. But before I do that, I want to introduce Joia, give a little bit more of her background before we turn the floor over to her. So Joia is the world's premier excellence coach, a leader in luxury entrepreneurship with a background in luxury travel and luxury retreats. Joia's mission is to elevate luxury to make it synonymous with excellence, human greatness, and human flourishing. Joia is also a co-founder of 1776 Forward, which, as we described, is a new organization that's crowdsourcing activism for the cause of philosophical liberalism. So Joia, thank you for being with us and agreeing to tell your story before we go grill everyone else that's to come. I guess we'll just jump right in. So
yeah, let's do it.
Let's start at the beginning, and maybe you can tell us how you came to your advocacy and valuing of free speech. Have you always been an advocate of free speech? And yeah, how you came to this.
It's interesting. So I'm an 80s baby. I was a teenager in the 90s. And for any of our listeners or viewers who were not around or don't remember that time, my experience of growing up was that free speech was a kind of given. It was somewhat the equivalent of the abolition of slavery, in that you knew that in dark times past, there were people who were against free speech, and there are still places in the world where free speech is not a cultural value, but that as the world is progressing, as humanity is becoming more enlightened, that people recognize that free speech is a good, the same way that the abolition of slavery was a good. And honestly, it was something that I always took for granted. So if you would ask me when I was a teenager about free speech, it was just an obvious thing and not something that I recognized the need to be an advocate for. And everything changed for me really during this seminal experience that you described that we went through together. We were both in college at NYU. I was a graduate student at the time, and we were putting on an event dealing with the Danish cartoon controversy that had happened back in the early 2000s. And it was interesting that even in the 90s, when I say that almost everyone agreed with free speech, the people who were against free speech were religionists who objected to perhaps profanity in music lyrics. And admittedly, if that's your perspective, you might have found that offensive, but it was understood that free speech was a value that would override that. So now here we are in the early 2000s, a different religion, but a similar situation that people of that religion were offended by cartoons. And we were putting on this event to support those who were making the cartoons. And the thing that really struck me was that the administration didn't have this wholehearted grasp and advocacy of free speech. It was as mind-boggling to me as if they didn't just come out and say, well, of course, slavery is wrong. And that was really a turning point for me to realize that free speech is a value that, one, I needed to understand it more, to understand the history, what exactly it entails legally, culturally, and the importance of standing up and speaking out for it. And unfortunately, in the 15 plus years since we've done that event, it's only become more necessary.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I know very, very well the event of which you spoke, and I spoke on it similarly in my discussion for those who want to hear. Um, I guess then, in the work you've done on free speech in the intervening years, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on why you think freedom of speech matters, both for you personally and for society as a whole.
You described that the organization or founding is about the cause of philosophical liberalism. And that's really a topic that I've spent decades now. Since my background, I started out as a graduate student in academia. I've always loved big ideas. I was an English major precisely because it allowed me to do interdisciplinary work with philosophy and psychology. And I really brought the thoughts and ideas and wisdom from all of those disciplines into the entrepreneurial work that I do now. And really thinking about this question of human flourishing as it pertains to myself, my own life, and what that means for human beings, society around us as a whole, and humanity, the past and the future generations, many future generations yet to come. And free speech matters because a vision of how it is that human beings not only survive, but thrive. I like to describe the human being as the creator trader, that we have a nature where we are both social and individual. And the way that we survive and thrive is precisely by problem solving, creating, developing resources, and then trading amongst ourselves in different specializations. And in order to fully think and express ourselves requires free speech. Free speech, it's what we call this, but it goes beyond just the words that come out of our mouth. It pertains to writing, all forms of expression. And we don't only just think in a vacuum, we think in dialogue and debate from others. And that dialogue and debate is also crucial for how the scientific method works, for how we validate ideas, for how we overcome some of our own biases, for how we grow, develop new ideas. So, just knowing from myself, from my own history, how much I've gained from questioning my own thoughts, from engaging with dialogue and debate with others, how that's helped me develop my own work and ideas, and then just understanding the broad sweep of humanity, how important that is for humanity to flourish and thrive.
So well said. The personal becomes the social in this domain because so many of the lessons relate, I think, on both levels. So thank you for that. Um, let's maybe go a little bit more kind of nuts and bolts then, turning to kind of how you activate and stand up and speak out. Can you maybe describe for our listeners your mental process for how you prepare for whether it's a speech, a piece of writing, or an activism moment? What are some of the key things that you're thinking about, and any tools you use to be a good communicator?
Well, I already told you that my background started out as an English major. I went to college to be a professor of English. And if you were at NYU at a certain time, I might have been the teacher that was grading and critiquing your writing. And through all of that experience, I really boiled down my own process into 5 core principles and one pet peeve, which I will share. And the 5 principles that guide how I write, there's 2 that pertain to the what, and 3 that are all about the how. So my 5 principles are to make it relevant and unique, and then clear, brief, and poetic. I'm just going through them really quickly.
Mhm.
Relevant, to me, that actually covers a range of topics of making sure that what it is that I'm saying will be true, useful to the audience, that it will be something that matters, that could make a difference. Relevance captures all of that for me. And then also unique. And here I have to say that over time, I've come to value the importance of repetition. That's something that I didn't always value quite so much, but through the years, I've recognized the wisdom in repetition, that in communication, it is important to repeat a message to an audience again and again. That said, I do believe that it always helps to at least have a unique perspective, unique spin. So even when you're conveying the same idea, certain ideas that are important to say need to be said again and again. So free speech, let's say, is not necessarily a unique idea, but we're sharing unique stories. All of these podcasts will be different. Everyone has their own unique perspective on it, so that there's always that uniqueness. And then in terms of the style, clarity is always the first thing, to make sure that what you're saying is clear, and then to try to keep it as simple and brief as possible. And then poetry to me captures both the sound of the words, the rhythm, rhyming assonance that makes it pleasurable and easy to remember and get in the groove, and also that level of imagery and symbolism and layering on verbal complexity that can go into a piece of writing. So those are my 5 principles for thinking about writing: relevance, uniqueness, clarity, brevity, and poetry. And then the one pet peeve that I will share. So if you are ever in a class where I'm grading your writing, the thing that I will always ding you on is cliches. Cliches just represent stale, prepackaged thinking. And there is a real way when, for example, if you're doing an interview such as this, where it's off the cuff, where you're speaking out, that sometimes the cliche is what comes to mind. It's the first thing that comes out, and it can be a great thing in a first draft or in an extemporaneous speech as you're getting your ideas out. But it's always useful to examine the cliche. What exactly do you mean by this phrase? And to really put some thought into that. So every time I find myself using a cliche, to ask myself, what do I really mean by this? And then to get at something that's more true, more authentic, deeper. Those are my writing principles in a nutshell.
That's great. And I love that you boiled it down to kind of 5 easy to grasp and easy to follow and practice principles and techniques. So thank you. Now, I guess you could say, taking those principles or other ideas you have, let's jump into maybe a little bit of fantasy land here for a minute and just say, if you had all the time and money available or no limits on either, what project or specific cause do you think is most worth pursuing right now, or that you would invest in to have kind of the greatest impact on growing the culture of free speech?
Well, I hope our listeners and viewers will check out your interview where you talked all about education and what that means to you and your vision of how education is so important for free speech. And especially given my personal background, education is where I'm definitely focused for the long term. I have a vision of creating new forms of higher education, really a replacement for higher education that recognizes the value of lifelong learning, and kind of organization or institutions specifically for entrepreneurs. But interestingly, as much as I envision this higher education alternative that's for entrepreneurs, it will include business wisdom, but it will also include what's been traditionally known as the liberal arts and sciences, and to really explore why they have been called the liberal arts and sciences, the freedom of thought that is required, that ties into the idea of freedom of speech, and just making that a bedrock principle and something to explicitly explore and to uphold the value and to teach all the future generations about the value of free speech. I love Fired how they describe free speech as the eternally radical idea. And there's, I think, great wisdom, something that I didn't appreciate until after the experiences that we described, when I realized how counterintuitive free speech really is. That it's so easy for humanity to want to conform to the tribe, or to want to easily believe in the certainty of the ideas that they've had. So free speech, which asks you to constantly question your ideas, bring in dissident perspectives, never assume that you've reached final truth on anything, and to be welcoming to different viewpoints. It is a counterintuitive idea and value, and one that we continually need to explore, refresh, and uphold.
Well, certainly the mere presence, I guess you could say, of this podcast is one illustration of that constant need and vigilance. So I love that. And I look forward to working with you on this project, among others, through our organization to achieve that. So it looks like we're coming up on our targeted time for this. We do have one more question, which is perfect. And I think it's perhaps one of the most impactful for our listeners, which is any advice for other aspiring free speech activists, or even just the average concerned citizen who's facing an issue of censorship or intimidation, looking to find their voice and stand up and speak out. What would you tell them?
One of the things I always think about on this question is, you might be familiar with Bonnie Ware famously did a study on regrets of the dying. And one of the biggest regrets, one of the top 5 regrets that people on their deathbed wish that they had done in their life, was to freely express themselves. That it's one of the best ways to be true to yourself and also bring the best of yourself to society, to humanity. That keeping that hidden is the worst thing you can do, not only for yourself, but for those around you. So even in situations where there might be fears, there might be legitimate concerns, there is a real way in which, when power rises, the obvious thing for people in position and power to do is to dampen down perspectives that they don't want to hear. And so it will come up again and again that people in power will want to silence viewpoints that they disagree with, that go against their agendas. But when you have your own vision of the truth, that it is important to speak that out, and then to know that it doesn't have to be perfect or definitive, that as a human being you are a growing being, so that the best you can do is to speak the truth as best as you see it now, and that if you do that, you've served yourself and you've served the wider world.
I love that. Thank you. Wonderfully said. Well, that does get through our questions for the series. So thank you for the time, and thank you for introducing yourself and giving everyone an inside view to your story of how you came to this place. You will get to know more about both of us over time as we interview all the exciting guests to come, as we launch this podcast series. And so look out for the follow-on episodes. For the initial launch period, we intend to do bi-monthly podcasts, so you can look for a new episode dropping every 2 weeks. And if you want to learn more about our organization, you can find us at 1776forward.com or ilv.org. I believe it's .org or .com. So
It's .org.
Okay. But thank
and
you.
ours is also .org too. I think we have both the .com and the .org registration.
Oh, that's right. Because we did take both of the URLs down. I always get confused which one. So
But
anyway,
you can go to either. So
you can go to either. That's right. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.
thank you again, Chris.